Kitty Cat Bedtime Story, Lost and Found. Calvin Turner and his stepson Eric lived in a rundown old house in a rundown section of the city. Eric was only 12 years old, and he was very ill. Calvin took care of him, and he loved him as if he were his own flesh and blood son. They had a black cat that they loved very much, and his name was Flavius. And Flavius loved his people as much as they loved him. Now, Eric got very, very sick one day and had to go to the hospital many hours from where he and Calvin lived. In fact, he ended up spending nearly a whole month there. Eric was afraid, so Calvin stayed with him at the hospital. But unfortunately, Flavius was not allowed at the hospital. Eric's Aunt Petunia lived in the same city. She was a very mean person, but Calvin and Eric had no choice. Their beloved friend, Flavius the cat, could not be left all alone for all that time. So Calvin asked her if she could come to their house and feed Flavius and spend a little time with him so he would not be too lonely. And Petunia did not like animals. Well, she didn't like people that much either. But she begrudgingly agreed to feed and visit Flavius. There was only one rule. Never, ever, ever let Flavius outside. He had never been outside except on a leash with Calvin and Eric. Eric had planted a special catnip garden for Flavius, and he would take him on the leash out to the backyard to inspect his crops. One night after Eric had surgery, Calvin called Petunia to see how their friend Flavius was doing. And she told him, "The stupid cat got out." And there was anger in her voice. "How?" Calvin asked. "I left the door open to let some fresh air in, and then went to get its food. That must be when it happened." "When? Did he come home? Is he back?" "Oh, that was 3 days ago. I don't know if he came back. I didn't waste my time going back to check." Her voice had no emotion at all. She didn't care and almost seemed happy that she had caused hurt. Now, Calvin wanted to lash out at her, but he kept back his temper and held back the tears. Calvin could not tell his young son Eric, especially since he had just been operated on. So, when he knew Eric was doing well, he drove home through the dark of night in hopes of finding their dear little friend. As he drove through the dark, he prayed that he would find Flavius safe. But it was winter and very cold, and Flavius had never been out in the cold and snow. So Calvin was afraid Flavius would have no idea how to survive. And he pictured the little black cat, lonely and alone in the cold and dark, wondering why his people had deserted him. It was very late when Calvin pulled into the driveway of the rundown old house. He hopped out of his car and was in hopes that Flavius would see him and would come running to him. But that didn't happen. Calvin looked about in the light of the full moon, and there was no sign of Flavius except a few small footprints that had been filled in with snow. And rather than go in, Calvin started out walking and calling softly in the night for his little friend. And he walked on and on for many blocks, but saw nothing of Flavius. Downhearted and dejected, Calvin made his way back home, and he went inside. It was very early in the morning, and he decided to wait till later to head back to the hospital. But rather than get undressed and going to his bedroom, he opened the front door of the house, then bundled up in 4 or 5 blankets and lay down on the icy floor. Calvin thought if Flavius came home looking for his people, he would see him laying there. It was so very cold, but Calvin was so tired that he drifted off to sleep as the chilled wind landed flakes of snow on his face. But before Calvin fell asleep, he prayed for Eric, and then he prayed for their little friend Flavius. He dreamed that as he laid there, that Flavius found him and crawled inside the blanket with him to stay warm. It was daylight when he heard a familiar voice of an elderly Sarah Davis, their next-door neighbor. "My God, Calvin, are you all right? Why are you sleeping there in the cold?" Calvin opened his still weary eyes, and as she asked, "Is Eric all right? Is he home from the hospital?" Calvin sat up, wiping the sleep from his eyes, and he explained to her what had happened with Flavius. "You should have never asked that aunt of his. She is as mean as can be. You should have asked me to watch him." "Well," Calvin replied, "I didn't want to bother you, and I know you had not been feeling very well." But just right then, there was a movement under the thick cover of blankets, and they both looked startled at first. Then there came the familiar meow. Calvin's heart skipped a beat, and he threw out the blanket, and in a flurry, a bundle of black fur leapt into Calvin's arms. It was Flavius, and he was making no secret of how much he had missed Kelvin. Kelvin hugged and hugged him. "It wasn't a dream. You really came back during the night. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for Flavius being safe at home." And Mrs. Davis stood there all smiles, trying to hold back tears. And then she said, "God is so good. Well, get up off that cold floor before you get pneumonia. You two warm up, and I'll scoot to the kitchen and fix something nice and hot for breakfast." Sarah Davis offered to keep Flavius until Eric came home. But Kelvin was not taking any chances with his little friend this time. Kelvin had been staying at the hospital, but he called and found a hotel close to the hospital that would accept pets. So he packed supplies for Flavius and headed back downstate to the hospital. But there was a surprise in store for Eric, to be sure. He was going to have a very special visitor. You see, the hospital agreed to let Kelvin bring Flavius for a visit as long as he had had his shots. And when Eric saw his best little friend, his face lit up and his outlook improved. Flavius jumped from Kelvin's arms right up close to Eric, where he snuggled up to his best human buddy. Eric was all smiles despite the bandages on his head from the surgery. "Dad, I've got one question." "Okay, what is it, son?" "Why is Flavius wearing your necktie?" "Well, the hospital said I had to have him on a leash, and I forgot to bring it with me. So I figured the necktie would work all right, too." The nurse standing by Eric had burst out laughing, as did Eric and Kelvin, as Flavius looked on like they were all crazy. Everyone was happy, and Eric never knew till much later what his aunt had done. And by the time summer arrived, Eric was feeling much better and was able to take Flavius out to check his catnip crops. Once again, "Shh, is your little buddy sleeping?" Well, I hope you've enjoyed this bedtime story for kittens, and I hope that you will subscribe and push that bell icon, because there'll be other bedtime stories and lots of other videos coming up here on the Dennis Morrison channel. Thank you for stopping by, and God bless.